The black waitress was fired and publicly humiliated in front of Seoul's wealthiest elite. But the moment the Korean mafia boss stood up and fixed his eyes on her, the screams of the manager were silenced by a terror that would bring the most dangerous men in the city to their knees. The pristine white tray slipped from Naelis's trembling fingers, hitting the marble floor with a hollow thud as the restaurant manager's face twisted with a sharp, hysterical cruelty. In the center of the elite glass cathedral, the hardworking black waitress was being stripped of her name tag and branded as disposable to appease entitled regulars. As she stood there with tears blurring her vision, Jae-Seok emerged from the shadows like a statue in his tailored black suit, his neck tattoos dark and menacing. While the manager roared that he had finally fired her, he didn't notice the room go Arctic or the way the mafia boss was now watching with lethal calm. Without saying a single word, Jae-Seok had already decided her fate was no longer in the manager's hands. She was his. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment protect if you think this waitress fired by a coward deserves the ultimate protection. I'll be replying to your comments to see how far our story is going. The neon glow of Seoul's Itaewon district never felt like a welcome. It felt like a warning. For Naelis, being a black waitress in the heart of a city that often looked through her was a daily exercise in desperate fighting. Every shift at the glass cathedral was a battle against the clock and the quiet prejudices that hummed beneath the restaurant's gilded surface. Before the night she was eventually fired, Naelis existed in the margins, her life a repetitive cycle of polished silver and sore feet, all to keep a roof over her head in a land that still felt like a beautiful, cold prison. She remembered the first time the atmosphere of the room shifted, not with a shout, but with a sudden, suffocating silence. It was 3 months ago, during a double shift that had left her spirit frayed. The heavy glass doors swung open, and the air seemed to crystallize. Jae-Seok walked in, flanked by men whose shadows seemed longer and darker than anyone else's. He didn't look like the other wealthy patrons. He looked like the man who owned the ground they walked on. Naelis had been assigned to his private booth. As she approached, her heart did that stupid, panicked flutter. She was a waitress used to handling demanding CEOs, but this Korean mafia boss was different. He didn't look at the menu. He didn't even look at his companions. His eyes were fixed on the window, watching the rain, his menacing presence filling the small space until Naelis felt like she was breathing in static. When she placed the water down, her hand trembled, just a fraction. Jae-Seok's gaze snapped from the window to her face. It was a forbidden moment of eye contact that lasted a heartbeat too long. In his dark, Arctic eyes, she didn't see the usual dismissal she received from the elite. She saw a sharp, calculating curiosity. He took in her powder blue uniform, the exhaustion etched into her features, and the defiant way she squared her shoulders despite her fear. He hadn't spoken then, and he hadn't protected her yet. He had simply watched as the manager hovered nearby, ready to pounce if she made a single mistake. That was the first time she felt the weight of the mafia boss and his absolute judgment. She had known then that this menacing stranger would eventually be the only thing standing between her and the streets after she was fired. She only knew that for the first time in Seoul, someone had truly seen her, and that realization was more terrifying than being alone. The glass cathedral lived up to its name, a soaring monument of crystal and chrome where the city's elite came to be seen while remaining untouchable. For Naelis, the restaurant was a theater of high-stakes perfection where a single fingerprint on a wine glass could mean being fired on the spot. As a black waitress navigating this labyrinth of designer heels and hushed power plays, she moved with a worn grace, her body operating on muscle memory even as her spirit felt the weight of 1,000 dismissive glances. Tonight, the air in the dining room was particularly thin. The click of designer heels echoed like metronomes against the polished floor, marking the arrival of Seoul's most influential socialites. Naelis glided between tables, balancing heavy trays with an elegance that masked her exhaustion. Every time she pivoted, she felt the Arctic gaze of the Korean mafia boss following her from his secluded corner. Jae-Seok sat in the velvet shadows, a statue of dark silk and lethal calm, his presence acting as a silent anchor in the chaotic room. From his vantage point, Jae-Seok watched the way the light caught the soot-stained reality of Naelis's tireless work, contrasting sharply with the saccharine smiles of the women in silk blouses who treated her as part of the furniture. He saw the subtle flinch in her shoulders when the manager hissed a correction in her ear, a predatory warning that he would have her fired if she let her worn grace slip for even a second. The mafia boss didn't reach for his drink. He simply watched the desperate fighting in her eyes, a reflection of a struggle he understood better than anyone in this room of pearls and Chanel. As the evening peaked, a calculating tension began to brew at a central table occupied by the manager's most favored regulars. Naelis poured the wine, her movements precise, yet the ice sliding down her spine told her the atmosphere was changing. She was just a waitress doing her job, but in the eyes of the elite, she was a target for their boredom. From the shadows, Jae-Seok's neck tattoos seemed to darken as he sensed the impending humiliation. He knew the roar of silence was coming, the moment before a life is thrown away like garbage, and for the first time, the cold indifference in his chest began to stir with a dangerous, protective heat. The air in the glass cathedral grew heavy, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the unspoken cruelty of the bored elite. Naelis approached the center table, her worn grace intact, unaware that a calculating regular had been watching her every move with eyes that were dark and narrowed. This customer, a woman draped in silk who viewed the black waitress as nothing more than a convenient scapegoat, waited for the perfect moment of distraction. As Naelis leaned in to clear a crystal flute, the woman's perfectly manicured hand moved with the precision of a thief, sliding a heavy, diamond-encrusted bracelet into the deep pocket of Naelis's apron. The trap was set like a loaded gun, and Naelis felt the first shiver of ice sliding down her spine before a word was even spoken. A sudden, shrill cry shattered the restaurant's carefully curated ambience. "My bracelet! It's gone!" The woman shrieked, her voice sharp and hysterical as she pointed a trembling finger at Naelis. The manager appeared instantly, his face a mask of saccharine concern that quickly hardened into absolute judgment when he looked at his employee. "Search her," the manager barked, his voice echoing through the silent dining room. Naelis stood frozen, the terror clawing up her throat as the manager's hands reached for her apron. When the diamonds tumbled out, glittering under the chandelier like a noose made of light, the room gasped. Naelis's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to scream that she was innocent, but she had watched enough crime dramas to know that a powerful manager would never believe a woman they deemed trash over a wealthy client. From the velvet shadows, the Korean mafia boss watched the scene unfold with cold indifference, his hand resting on his lapel in a gesture of terrifying authority. Jae-Seok didn't join the chorus of accusations, but his arctic gaze remained fixed on the black waitress, who looked small and defeated, in the center of the storm. The manager leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear as he prepared to deliver the final blow. "You're done," he hissed, the threat of being fired now a physical weight. Naelis looked toward the mafia boss, searching for a single spark of doubt in his dark eyes, but saw only the immaculate stillness of a man who lived by his own lethal rules. The silence that followed the accusation was not empty. It was a roar that filled Naelis's ears, drowning out the frantic beating of her heart. The manager, his face flushed with a strange, triumphant gleam, didn't hesitate. He reached out and snatched the name tag from her chest, the sharp click of the plastic breaking sounding like a crack in the foundation of her life. "You are fired," he spat, the words landing with the weight of a noose made of light. Naelis watched her apron hit the marble floor, the fabric landing with a hollow thud that echoed through the stunned restaurant, signaling the end of her desperate fighting to belong in this city. The black waitress stood exposed, her tears blurring her vision as she realized she was being thrown away like garbage, based on a lie. The designer heels of the elite patrons shifted as they turned away, their cold indifference a silent wall that Naelis couldn't climb. She felt small and defeated, a common criminal in a powder blue uniform that was now a badge of shame. Just as she turned to leave, her brown leather suitcase, of dreams feeling lighter than the air, a new sound cut through the manager's gloating. From the dark velvet booth, Jae-Seok moved. The lethal calm that usually surrounded the Korean mafia boss had sharpened into something dangerous and menacing. He didn't shout. He simply checked his silver watch with a chilling precision that made the manager's breath hitch in his throat. The neck tattoos above Jae-Seok's white collar seemed to pulse as he slowly stood up, his immaculate black suit catching the light of the chandeliers. The entire room seemed to freeze as the mafia boss stepped into the light, his eyes carved from ice and fixed solely on the woman who had just been fired. He didn't look at the manager, nor the calculating woman who had planted the jewels. He walked toward Naelis, his designer shoes clicking with a steady, predatory rhythm that silenced the hysterical whispers of the crowd. As he reached her, the absolute authority he projected brought the dangerous man to his knees in a different way, not in weakness, but in a focused, terrifying attention that suggested the waitress fired was under a protection that no one in Seoul dared to challenge. The manager's triumphant smirk withered into a mask of pure primal terror as Jae-Seok stepped into the center of the restaurant. The lethal calm of the Korean mafia boss was more deafening than any shout, a heavy pressure that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the glass cathedral. He didn't spare a glance for the stolen diamonds or the crocodile tears of the wealthy socialite. Instead, his eyes, carved from ice, remained fixed on the manager, who was still clutching the name tag he had torn from the black waitress. "You seem to have forgotten who owns the ground you stand on," Jae-Seok said, his voice a low rumble that carried the weight of an execution order. He moved with cold calculation, pulling a slim leather ledger from his jacket, a record of debts that reached far deeper than restaurant accounts. The manager's hands began to shake so violently the name tag fell, landing near Naelis's feet with a pathetic click. He knew that in Jae-Seok's world, discretion was more valuable than publicity, and he had just made a very public mistake. 300 million, Jae-Seok murmured, citing a shipping deal that went south, and a gambling debt the manager had tried to bury beneath the restaurant's profits. "I chose not to collect because you were efficient. But tonight, you became a liability." The mafia boss leaned in, his neck tattoos dark and menacing under the crystal lights, his proximity forcing the antagonist to stumble backward against a table. With a single flick of his fingers, Jae-Seok signaled his lieutenants, who appeared from the shadows like statues in black suits. The man who had just fired her now looked small and defeated, his life being dismantled brick by brick in front of the very elite he had tried to appease. Jae-Seok finally looked at Naelis, his arctic expression softening by only a fraction, a forbidden spark of protection replacing his usual emotional detachment. He didn't ask for permission. He simply claimed control of the room. "The waitress fired tonight is the only person in this building with any value," he stated, his voice like steel. As the guards escorted the manager toward the exit, his mercy expired. Jae-Seok reached out and picked up Naelis's discarded apron, handing it back to her not as a servant's garment, but as a symbol of the power shift that had just occurred. The restaurant had become a tomb of glass and velvet. Following the violent removal of the manager, the remaining patrons sat like statues, their designer heels no longer clicking, paralyzed by the absolute authority radiating from the center of the room. Naelis stood amidst the wreckage of her career, clutching the apron the Korean mafia boss had returned to her. She was no longer just a waitress fired in a moment of public malice. She was the focal point of a forbidden curiosity that made her skin prickle with unease. Jae-Seok didn't turn back to his men or his drink. He stepped closer, invading her personal space until the scent of expensive tobacco and rain-drenched cedar enveloped her. For the first time since she had arrived in Seoul, this dangerous man finally looked at her, not as a ghost in a powder blue uniform, but as a person. In those dark eyes, Naelis expected to find the cold, absolute judgment that had characterized their previous silent encounters. Instead, she saw a flicker of something raw and unshielded, a suppressed desire mixed with a heavy, protective sorrow. "You don't have to stay here," Jae-Seok said, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. It was a low, dangerous tone, but the edge was gone, replaced by a resonance that felt like a benediction. Naelis swallowed hard, her tears drying into something harder as she met his gaze. "Why did you do it?" "I'm just a black waitress. To people like them, to people like you, I'm disposable." A muscle jumped in Jae-Seok's jaw, his neck tattoos shifting with the movement. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he caught himself, a brief lapse in his emotional detachment. "I've spent my life surrounded by people who claim to be loyal while hiding diamond necklaces in the dark," he murmured, referencing the calculating deceit he saw every day. "You are the only thing in this cathedral that isn't a lie." The ice sliding down her spine finally began to melt, replaced by a charged emotional tension that felt both like a rescue and a new kind of danger. Naelis saw that his Arctic exterior was a mask, a prison he had built for himself just as surely as the city had built one for her. In that forbidden gaze, she realized the Mafia boss wasn't just claiming control over her fate. He was looking for a way to save his own. "Come with me," he offered, his hand extending in a reverent promise. "And I swear on my life, you will never be treated like trash again." The rain outside the glass cathedral was a torrential downpour, turning the neon-lit streets of Seoul into a blurred river of brake lights. Naelis stepped through the heavy doors. No longer the black waitress the world had tried to break, but a woman walking in the shadow of a dangerous man. The cold air hit her skin, yet for the first time in years, she didn't flinch. Behind her, the restaurant was a prison of shattered glass and ruined reputations, but ahead, the Korean mafia boss held open the door to his sleek black car, his neck tattoos gleaming under the street lamps like a warning to the rest of the world. As the engine roared to life, Naelis sank into the leather seat, the hollow thud of the door closing acting as a final decisive click to her old life. She looked at her hands, the hands of a waitress fired for a crime she didn't commit, and realized they were finally still. Jae-Seok gunned the engine, the car screaming out into the night with a speed that pushed the limits of the law. He didn't speak, but his presence was a lethal calm that acted as a shield against the city that had treated her as disposable. They moved through the glass cathedral of the skyline, bypassing the crowded terminals of her past fears. Jae-Seok drove with a cold calculation, his eyes carved from ice as he navigated the hydroplaning tires through the storm. When they finally pulled into the circular driveway of a secluded mansion, the silence was too quiet, yet it lacked the deathly weight of the restaurant. He turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face for any lingering trauma. "This is not a cage," the mafia boss murmured, his voice a low, dangerous resonance that felt like a benediction. "In this house, no one will ever bring you to your knees again." Naelis looked at him, seeing past the menacing exterior to the man who had humbled his own empire to offer her a sense of safety. In this shelter of the tiger, the waitress fired by a coward found a sanctuary that the city could never provide. For the first time, the ice sliding down her spine was replaced by the possibility of a life where she was finally, truly seen. The sanctuary of the mansion was short-lived, as the roar of silence from the city's underground finally reached the gates. Inside the study, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and old tobacco, but the mood was arctic. Jae-Seok stood by the window, his neck tattoos stark against the moonlight, while his most trusted lieutenants stood before him like statues carved from shadow. They didn't see a woman who had been a black waitress surviving on worn grace. They saw a liability that threatened the stability of an empire built on cold calculation. "The council is asking questions, sir," his head of security began, his voice low and dangerous. A Korean mafia boss does not humiliate the shipping industry's elite for a girl who is just fired. "It makes you look reachable." The word hung in the air like a noose made of light. The stakes had shifted from a restaurant's public humiliation to a war for the throne. If Jae-Seok didn't treat her as disposable, the rivals who watched from the shadows would move to take everything he had built. Jae-Seok checked his silver watch, the gesture of authority carved from ice. He thought of Naelis upstairs, finally sleeping without the ice sliding down her spine, and realized that his absolute judgment had changed. "You think she is a weakness," the Mafia boss murmured, his voice so quiet it was almost inaudible, yet carrying the weight of a lethal promise. "But she is the only person who hasn't tried to steal a diamond necklace from my soul." The tension in the room was a loaded gun. His men shifted, waiting for an order that would restore the status quo, but Jae-Seok had already claimed control in a way they couldn't understand. He was choosing the waitress fired by a broken system over the mercy-expired politics of his world. "Tell the council that if they want to discuss my weakness, they can do it to my face," he stated, his absolute authority, leaving no room for defiance. As he dismissed them, the decisive click of the door signaled that he was no longer just protecting a woman. He was burning his empire to keep her warm. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the estate, casting long shadows across the floor where Naelis stood, her brown leather suitcase packed once more. She was no longer the black waitress trapped in a cycle of desperate fighting, but the weight of being fired still lingered like a hollow thud in her chest. She looked toward the door, expecting to see the menacing figure of a ruler, but instead, she found a man who had stripped away his Arctic armor. Han Jae-Seok entered the room, the final decisive click of the door behind him signaling the end of the empire he had been willing to burn. The lethal calm that defined the Korean mafia boss was replaced by a reverent stillness. He didn't approach with the absolute authority of a master. Instead, he did something that would have brought the underground elite to their knees in shock. He humbled himself, sinking to one knee on the polished floor before her, mirroring the moment he had claimed her fate at the restaurant. "I was a man of cold indifference and absolute judgment," he murmured, his voice cracking with a vulnerability she had never seen. "I watched you work with worn grace and treated your struggle as part of the scenery. But the night you were fired, I realized that a world without you is just a prison of glass and stone." He reached for her hand, his neck tattoos visible as he bowed his head, pressing his forehead to her knuckles in a benediction of silent apology. Naelis looked down at the dangerous man who was now a shield. The ice sliding down her spine was gone, replaced by a possibility of a life where she was finally the one in control. "If I stay," she said, her voice steady and clear, "things change. I am not just the waitress fired to save your reputation. I am not disposable." Jae-Seok looked up, his dark eyes filled with a reverent promise. "You never were disposable. I was just too arrogant to see what was right in front of me." As she pulled him up to his feet, the Sir dynamic was over. They stood together against the rain-streaked windows of their past, beginning a forbidden story where love finally defied the logic of power. Check out the other videos on the channel. I think you'll find something that speaks to you. Drop a comment letting me know what you thought of this one. Your city, your takeaway, anything. We read every single one. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next video.